St. Mary's is coming off a bounce back win against Davidson, so I'm really happy to bring in Alex Jensen, voice of the Gaels, on to talk about not only that, but then what we've seen from St. Mary's over the last couple of weeks. Alex, how's it going? And how was your Thanksgiving?
It was great, Zach. Thanks for having me. It's nice to see you. Thanksgiving was good. Just spent some time with family. My wife and I are in the middle of moving right now, so it's a little hectic, but all's well. How was your Thanksgiving?
A little chaotic as well. Have to bounce between a few different houses during
Yeah,
the
and it's
weekend.
feast week.
And it's feast week. A lot of basketball to be tracking throughout the course of the week. Gonzaga obviously doing what they did. What, 3 or 4 WCC teams in tournaments, but looking at St. Mary's, it's like it was really nice to see St. Mary's bounce back against Davidson on Friday night, Friday afternoon, I guess. It was the matinee version of St. Mary's basketball. And after 2 really disappointing losses in Vegas, to see them kind of get back to what we're used to seeing with this team. Kind of what was your read going into that one? Because it really did seem like that this team needed a full reset. And on Friday, they looked like the St. Mary's of old.
Yeah, I going into the Davidson game, I really didn't think like things were as bad as they seemed, to be honest with you. I mean, obviously the results weren't what you want. The loss to Weber State was not a good loss. And then the San Diego State game kind of got out of hand. I think, San Diego, I mean, that was a 1-point game or 2-point game at the half. And San Diego State scored on 9 of their last possessions, really not in garbage time, but that was really more of a 10-point second half than what it ended up being. And then Xavier, again, in the first half, I felt like they generated good shots. And then Alex Dukas goes out, and it was kind of a similar effect to what we saw against UConn in the NCAA tournament, where, the Gaels really just had a hard time spacing the floor. That made life a lot harder on Aiden Mahaney and Mitchell Saxon. And Marciulionis really getting into the paint and, with paint touches on the post, what have you, and they just really couldn't get anything going. So the San Diego State game and the Xavier game, that first half at least, I really felt like they generated good shots. They just didn't get the shots to fall. And, I think that this team is also less of a finished product, Zach, coming into the season than maybe we thought in, October, just based on the fact that, not only were they losing 2 of their best defenders, they're really losing their 2 main leaders in Logan Johnson and Kyle Bowen. So when things don't go right, who's there to pick everybody up? In the past, it was those 2 guys. And there's a lot of guys figuring out new roles, both on the floor and in that leadership structure. And I think we're getting there. I think Alex Dukas took a really vocal role in practice between the San Diego State and Xavier game. So I do think that maybe we all overlooked those 2 things. The fact that this is just not as finished of a product coming into the year as we thought. The talent is certainly there. We saw the talent against New Mexico. We saw it against Davidson, as you mentioned, and, for a half against San Diego State. But again, I just didn't feel like they played as poorly as those results would suggest. I mean, they shot during that 3-game losing streak, Zach, under 22% from 3. And I felt like they had some good looks. And those numbers with a team this caliber that has this talent shouldn't repeat themselves too often.
Yeah, that was the one thing that almost the shocking thing, was just seeing how poorly they were shooting from 3, even though they did have a lot of good looks. But we also talked about just one of the things, and before we hit record, we talked a little bit about just like the pressure on Aiden Mahaney, and the fact that he's been kind of the lead scout, and that has obviously continued into this season, and that really seems that his struggles also were kind of coincided with the struggles of others, because when you have a Dukas, when you have a Marciulionis start to put in some buckets, get some points, it takes pressure off of someone like Mahaney, because then teams can't completely focus on him. And I feel like that's kind of like where they kind of got stuck, at least for a while.
Yeah, I think the Marciulionis part of that, when it comes to Mahaney, is critical. I felt like that Weber State game really turned when Augustus picked up his 4th foul. Had to come out for a good portion of the early part of that second half. But having him on the floor changes the dynamic a little bit. A junior who is a legit point guard, a guy who can run the offense, bring the ball up, and that allows the Gaels to get a little bit more creative with Aiden Mahaney being off the ball and creating more shots for him, creating more situations for him to be successful. So, Goose struggled with foul trouble really the first 4 or 5 games. He was ineffective in the San Diego State game and tweaked something and did not play much the second half. So I think he is critical to what this team does, not only offensively but defensively. I mean, you look at Davidson, right? And I would call them probably at this point a middle of the pack A10 team. But Grant Huffman is, kind of the head of the snake for Davidson, if you will. And when Augustus Marciulionis was on the floor, at least in the first half, because, the last 10 minutes or so of that game were kind of garbage time, he really struggled. So I really think, that Goose is the X factor for St. Mary's. If he's able to stay on the floor and be successful, it's a trickle-down effect to everybody else because he's the main guy creating shots. He's so good in ball screens, creating shots for others, I should say. And he's, he's a physical guard. So that helps him on both ends of the floor, both offensively, getting into the paint, getting to the basket, drawing. He draws a lot of fouls, and defensively, where he really draws the assignment on the other side. And then you mentioned Dukas. And, of course, his gravity helps space the floor. We saw that in the second half of the Xavier game. We saw it against UConn. Without Alex Dukas on the floor, you're going to make those other guys make shots to beat you because, going into that Davidson game, St. Mary's was, I think, 25% from three. And Dukas had been either, not knocking down, just going through a little bit of a cold stretch or off the floor. He only played 10 minutes, as we mentioned, against Xavier. So I think those are two guys that are really kind of the linchpins right now for St. Mary's on both ends of the floor. Marciulionis, his ability to run the offense, allow Mahaney to play off the ball a little bit more, and Dukas' gravity and his shooting ability. I think those two guys are critical. And for for a multitude of reasons, some of which we just mentioned, those two guys were factors in that 3-game losing streak.
There's always try to find at least a little bit of a silver lining in some of those losing streaks and whatnot. And so one of the things that we at least got to see a little bit more of was some different combinations from Randy Bennett in the rotations and what he was able to do. And we saw some Barrett and Dukas combinations. We saw even the potential of them going even bigger at times. So, I mean, what combinations or what did you see kind of like in like those moments where you started to see something that Randy Bennett threw out there that, hey, this might actually be something that they could use down the road?
I think Mason Forbes' ability to play both the 4 and the 5 really help with the versatility of some of the lineups that Randy Bennett can use. Obviously Forbes is more of a bruising type of 4. He's not a guy that's going to necessarily stretch the floor, but he's an excellent rebounder. He's strong and he's a good defender. And the fact that he can guard both the 4 and the 5, and offensively, for me, he's a little bit more of a 5, at least in St. Mary's 4-out system. That gives him some flexibility where you don't have to have a 7-footer on the floor, be it Saxon or Wessels. And it just gives you a few more options, especially defensively, for how to guard some of these lineups. You look at Gonzaga, maybe, and Anton Watson's been a beast so far, but, maybe a guy like Mason Forbes, a guy who's a little bit more limber and athletic, and, not the 7-footer, can match up with a guy like Anton Watson, or at least give him a different look. So that's the one that's interesting to me is how does that 5 position and in what types of matchups does Randy Bennett use Forbes at the 4 or the 5? Having him this year, Zach, it gives them some versatility, where you don't have to play a true 5 on the floor or a 7-footer. And, at times, some of those smaller lineups, we look at New Mexico a year ago, that has hurt the Gaels in the past. Chris Howell's another one who can, who's a bigger guard and can stick with, if you see a 3-guard lineup on the perimeter. But for me, that different lineup is seeing Forbes' ability to play both the 4 and the 5, because it really changes the way your front court looks on both sides of the ball. And depending on the matchup, it's a luxury for Randy Bennett to have that option to go either big or small with Mason at the 4 or the 5.
I mean, we're still very early into the season. We're only less than a month in, so we're still seeing a lot of different combinations and whatnot. And we talked about just some of like the losses that they've had recently, the 3-game losing streak, all that sort of stuff. But I was also starting to look. You have to start to look ahead, and St. Mary's has a couple of really tough games this week. You have Utah, you have Boise State in Idaho. Talk about a little bit about these two matchups. Have you had a little bit of time to kind of start to rate in on them, and just what just the opportunities that both of these teams present and what challenges that the Gaels will face against them.
Yeah, I think for Utah, you got to look at a guy like Brandon Carlson, and this may be a situation, Zach, where we see that rotation at the 5 kind of morph a little bit, right? I mean, Carlson's a guy that can really stretch the floor from that 5 position and knock down shots, and Utah is a team that wants to play up tempo, so we'll see how they do, and we know it's easier to slow the game down than it is to speed it up. At least what we've seen the Gaels over the last handful of years. There have been certain instances, of course, Gonzaga does it better than anybody. But it'll be an interesting matchup at the 5 because, the Gaels have that traditional back of the basket, Sachs and Wessels. Again, you have the option to play with Mason Forbes, but Carlson's been the Utes' best player, and Utah has. I know they've lost 2 in a row, but a win over Wake Forest. Outside of Houston and St. John's, those 2 losses, they haven't played anybody else in the top 75. So going on the road is going to be an interesting one for Utah, who's coming into play at 45 in KenPom. Just looking at their KenPom profile, Zach, that their adjusted tempos in the top 105, and we'll see when we get closer to the game, which is tomorrow, if the Utes are a team that needs transition to score. I think they can score in the half court. But again, their ability to stretch the floor is, with those bigs is a problem that, can really hurt anybody. And we'll see what Randy Bennett's counter is to that. Again, I think Mason Forbes could play a big role in this game in his ability to step out and guard the perimeter. Because you're going to, or do you put Joshua Jefferson on a guy like Carlson, who's at 7 feet, again, can stretch the floor a little bit? Boise State haven't looked a whole lot into the Broncos. I know they're a high-scoring club with a high-powered backcourt. And also they've been good defensively under Max Rice over the last few years. USF gave them a solid game in Boise, and maybe the Broncos have been a little bit disappointing to start the year, off to a 3-3 start. They played a very tough schedule, though. Another kind of slower team. They were, again, I remember them being a very good shooting team last year. They haven't shot it well so far this year. So, but it's an interesting point in the Gaels' schedule because I don't think anyone thought that St. Mary's would be 3-3 by this point. And these are 2 important games. You win both of these, I think I don't know if you're right back on track, but you're close to it. But how nice is it to see a Power 5 team come to Moraga? These are the kind of series that we've been waiting for.
Yeah, the future Big 12 Utah Utes coming in.
Hey, Craig Smith is doing a great job so far.
Yeah.
He's, I think that Utah, maybe, I know people have talked about them as a potential tournament team, probably a year ahead of schedule this year. So he did a great job at Utah State, and he's doing a great job at Utah. It's a great series for the Gaels to have. I know they're going to Utah either next year or the year after, but it's just nice to see these games being played on campus. And later on, Zach, I think really the Gaels' biggest opportunity is at Colorado State, because the Rams have been better, I think, than a lot of people thought. Isaiah Stevens, one of the best players in the country. Mm-hmm. And to play that game on the road, that represents a massive opportunity. Of course, you've got a lot to get through before getting there, but that's another one where you win at Colorado State and they play the way they have been all year. That's one that's going to age really well.
That is, yes, I agree. That'll age well, and that'll be a huge feather in the cap for this team if they can get that one. Also, because Colorado State is a team that they have struggled with over the last couple of years, and they've got them twice, once in Moraga, once up in Fort Collins. So that will be a really fascinating matchup. Hopefully, St. Mary's can completely right the ship before getting up there, because they're going to need essentially everything to kind of go their way to steal one, I would say, in Fort Collins.
It's a tough place to play. The Gaels went up there a couple of years ago, as you mentioned. The atmosphere was awesome. It was right before Christmas break, and it was sold out. The place was jumping. David Roddy had a huge second half. Isaiah Stevens had the big first half. And I thought they had some nice pieces last year. Of course, they're all a year older now, and they've got some. But both bigs can pop out to the 3-point line, which and when you have a guy like Isaiah Stevens at the point, it really represents some matchup problems for anybody.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thanks, Alex, for hopping on, taking some time to talk some St. Mary's basketball. We'll catch up down the road. Utah comes into Moraga on Monday, and then they head off to Boise over the weekend. Alex, thanks for hopping on, and we'll catch you down the road.
All right, Zach. Appreciate it, man. Good talking to you.
Too.